Hi, everyone. Welcome to your last lecture for our class on global politics, global problems, globalization. Um, this is Module 15, and as you know, this final week's topic is the topic of what we can do to change the world. It's a fascinating topic, really, and your author this week from the textbook, Maya Zafis, has some interesting points to make, which I must say I don't personally fully agree with, but that's not to say that I don't think she makes some great points and points that are seriously worth paying attention to. So to get this started, I just sort of want to put in context some fascinating developments in the year 2019 that really show how we continue to see large numbers of people trying to, well, precisely change the world, to engage with the world in a way that makes it a better place. But of course, how we make the world a better place and what it means to make the world a better place is very open to debate. In this photo, in the background photo here that you see in the slide, we have the protesters who have been very active in London this year, London, England, called Extinction Rebellion, XR. Extinction Rebellion here are protesting in the British House of Parliament, the House of Commons to be precise, and they are a political protest movement which is trying to use nonviolent resistance, methods of nonviolent resistance to protest against ostensibly climate breakdown, but also a number of other ecological concerns, including biodiversity loss and the risk, of course, of human extinction or human damage to massive numbers of human beings and their welfare, their livelihoods, in the context of ecological collapse and climate change. So these are not the only protests we could pick from the year 2019. One other significant protest, which we won't spend too much time talking about this module, although perhaps we could, it have been the Gilets jaunes protests in France against the gasoline taxes introduced, well, diesel oil taxes introduced by President Macron. But of course, that was at Christmas time, and the protests are still going, and they've been sort of becoming attached to other things, other kinds of demands now. So what does it mean then to speak in the year 2015 of these kinds of protests, disruptive protests, protests, if you will, of disobedience, very much following, by the way, in the kind of style of Martin Luther King, of Mahatma Gandhi, so point being that nonviolent protest, nonviolent forms of civil disobedience are not unusual in American history either, and we shouldn't think of them as such. I think one important factor here, however, is that if you go back to our module where we specifically looked at social movements and we have, at various times in this semester looked at social movements. We've looked at protest, we've looked at resistance in the context of Tiananmen Square, for example. We've looked at the fall of the Berlin Wall. We've looked at these moments specifically in our class on obedience, where people somehow seemingly wake up where they had previously maybe not been awake. They have a political awakening. They have a political kind of coming to terms with their circumstances and decide to do something about it. We've talked at length this semester about Tahrir Square, for example, and the context of the Arab Spring, largest protests in human history so far. But these people, that the Extinction Rebellion people, are the people I want to focus on at the start of this lecture. They really have dominated British politics in the last couple of months. This lecture is being recorded in the spring of 2019, of course, for those who may be watching it in future years. And in April 2019, Extinction Rebellion occupied numerous sites around London. And I think it's interesting that their primary symbol is the hourglass. You can see it here on the screen. The hourglass is there to sort of represent, I think, possibly two different meanings. The first meaning, of course, is that we're running out of time. The United Nations reports lately are telling us that we maybe have probably about 20 years to make some serious decisions about how we're allocating our production in our global society if we want to avert climate change. And the hour is running short, hence the hourglass icon, the hourglass image as the image of the Extinction Rebellion movement. But also, I think, perhaps the hour, the idea of the hour. We can say the hour is at hand, or we can say it's the hour of our awakening. So there's a certain sense of an awakening here that is implied, I think, by the hourglass. Now, these people cite as inspiration Occupy Wall Street, Mahatma Gandhi's independence movement in India. They cite the struggle of the suffragettes back in the 1920s to gain the right to vote here in the United States and elsewhere. They cite Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, all who adopted these nonviolent forms of civil disobedience to try to get their message out. They, as activists, have a belief, a conviction that by being the few that are willing to sort of put their bodies on the line to get arrested, and you see them here in this shot, they've glued themselves, they've glued their hands and their bottoms, their arms, other parts of their bodies to the House of Parliament observer decks windows, and that is to, again, sort of make it difficult to remove them. And by doing that, by creating that difficulty, there's an extension of the amount of time that the media can focus on what they're doing. And the media, therefore, is going to be broadcasting their message more than it might otherwise do, bringing the message to the attention then of the wider public, and hopefully in that way causing the public to think about the urgency of the need to address climate change, to be maybe inspired by the leadership of these few people and take up the cause themselves. Another example of this kind of struggle is the young lady in the image in the bottom of your screen here. That is Greta Tun Burg. She was born only in 2003. She's a Swedish teenager, 16 years old in 2019, with Asperger's syndrome. And in early 2019, she led a movement of high school students in Sweden who refused to go to school in order to try to shame Swedish politicians into action. Interestingly, she got diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at age 11, and that was the year that she stopped talking, and started talking again only when she felt she had to. She has a kind of a selective mutism, I think it's called. And that is that she's the kind of person that really only speaks when she feels she's got something to say. But she's been very vocal this year. And she has said that her disability, her autism, is an advantage because, of course, people with Asperger's see things in black and white terms, it is said. So she's kind of like, the advantage of Asperger's is, you can see things when they're obvious, right? When they're absolutely obvious to you, you can see them, and maybe in a way that other people can't, right? So her motto has been that you, the politicians, may say that we, the high school students, must go to school. And she says, but actually, we've done our homework, and we know that we have only 20 years or so to make major policy changes. or face certain environmental destruction. So she's like, well, why would we go to school if the environment's going to be shit? There's not a future there to go to school for, to make going to school worthwhile. So she, in saying these things, has inspired a number of young people around the world. And interestingly enough, on March 15th, 2019, an estimated 1.5 million high school students in 112 countries around the world joined her call to go on strike. I'm not sure if you can get with the idea of high school students going on strike, because of course, typically it's workers who go on strike, but this broadens the idea of what a strike means. It indicates something like a social strike or a wider societal refusal to be complicit, to go along with the flow, the status quo, and in so doing to alarm politicians, to put politicians on notice that the status quo is no longer acceptable and that they must take action. And interestingly, she's just recently been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's Greta Tun Burg. Now, this semester, we have looked at many problems in global politics, but really we've only skimmed the surface. We've looked at cases to do with war, but we haven't looked at cases to do with disease or famine or slavery or homophobia, and that's regrettable. We only have so much time, of course, to do everything, but it would be nice to have time with you to look at more of those issues. One issue that kind of comes to mind lately is the fact that we, may, in good faith, protest, as many do, for the need to open our borders to immigrants. And it seems that is a very good sort of idea in terms of its motivations, at least. Who does not want to take care of immigrants, many of whom are fleeing dire circumstances that have come about through no fault of their own. But it's interesting that sometimes we think of the politics of immigrants, or at least, if I can reframe it, the question of what we should do about immigrants, in terms of opening our borders or welcoming more in, when in actual fact we, in the same breath, while we protest or demand better rights for migrants, in the same breath buy cell phones that contain minerals like coltan, for example, that come from countries in South America or Africa where human rights are not exactly honored, and it's just interesting how we could be read as focusing our politics on the symptoms of the problem as opposed to our own involvement with the causes of the problem. Because when you think about it, immigrants have the right to be immigrants, right? At least in the sense that they have the right to, we might say, relocate, to move to a better world. That's where most of the people in the United States came from who live here today. You trace back their ancestry, and it's people who came here looking for a better life from Europe or wherever. But so we don't want to necessarily diminish that right, but at the same time, we need to sort of think about the right to remain at home, the right for migrants not to have to be migrants in the first place, to have a dignified life where they come from. And in focusing on the border, sometimes I feel like we are not focusing on the reasons why the migrants want to come in the first place. And we hold up, elevate, prop up many of the regimes that cause the political problems and the economic problems that support, that create these migrants in the first place, through our continued economic dependency on the various minerals and goods and services that come from these countries. It's certainly something to think about, especially when these countries have, a number of them have dire human rights records, intolerance of homophobia, intolerance of indigenous rights movements, intolerance of the struggle of the poor. It's certainly something to think about that the other end of the equation is a necessary part of the debate. So in saying that, of course, what I'm doing, I think, here is trying to identify that these problems are complex and they don't often have the silver bullet solution that many of our social movements tend to say that they have or suggest that they have. And indeed, once you start to think about that, a veritable Pandora's box opens for us, because the amount of problems in the world and the complexity of the solutions that they demand can appear overwhelming. How do we begin to prioritize? What are the first things that we can and should do? We are finite beings. We only have one heart, one brain. There's only so much love and thought and energy to go around. And of course, we have to take care of our own as well. We have to take care of our families, and that's understandable that we might want to prioritize our own. But it's that finitude that I'm trying to draw attention to here, and this question of what one person can do. Certainly we can do the things in our own individual lives which seem to make a difference. We can recycle our Coca-Cola cans. We can turn off the lights when we leave a room. We can be sure we buy only fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate to make sure that the farmers who grow those crops that go into those goods get a good salary, get a good wage, a human wage, a livable wage. We can try to buy local vegetables to offset carbon, making sure that we don't buy exotic fruits and vegetables from far away when we can get a lot of those things here at home. Buy local, save the earth. Right? We can drive a Prius car or an ecologically friendly car. We can buy, if we're getting married, we can seek to buy a wedding ring that has a diamond in it that doesn't come from a country where those diamonds are mined by slaves or people who are otherwise subjugated. These are, of course, so-called blood diamonds. Many diamonds on the global market today have very, very problematic origins. And if you are considering getting married, by the way, I would strongly urge you to get a second-hand diamond, a vintage diamond, or a diamond from a source that is ethically appropriate. Do make sure you do your history on where your diamonds come from. Most of us don't go around in our lives buying diamonds, but when we get married, we tend to, right? At least buy one. And there's a whole global economy of violence that comes from the purchasing of diamonds and the trading of diamonds. It's very important that we're aware of that. But again, the point is, a lot of this appears to depend on what we are thinking or doing as individuals. And, it doesn't really make a difference unless other people are with us, right? Change, societal change, can only really come through collective societal action. And it depends on many other people joining with us to make that change. So part of then securing the conditions of collective change is, of course, the fact that we might turn to government to help us secure that change. And of course, turning to government is important because it tends to lock in the change. Martin Luther King didn't just want to make people more aware of civil rights issues. He had to change the law, right? He had to lock in the change at the governmental level or at the level of the state. But of course, it's a catch-22 because on the one hand, if our actions don't change government policy, then it can be futile. Like the pursuit of change has been futile. Government needs to be involved in many instances. But on the other hand, if we do turn to government, it can come at a cost. Once we turn to the government, or to use the sort of academic expression of that, once we enter the state, once we have decided to enter into the realm of government or the state, we are effectively endorsing the state as the place where politics happens. And that comes with a cost because we're strengthening that entity, right? An entity which has historically equally been responsible for a lot of violence against the weak, the marginal, the innocent. And in this sense, then, the state, by us agreeing to enter it, can change us, can transform us by making us complicit with that violence. Think of it like the ring in The Lord of the Rings, right? Frodo, Bilbo, in their experience as ring wielders, experience that the power, the unlimited power of the ring changes them, right? They become desirous of the power of the ring, and it's hard for them to say no. It's like an addiction. And in that sense, I think the state also changes us. It's a little bit like the ring of power from the Lord of the Rings. To hold on to the power of the state once we have possessed it, we can even, and we've discussed this before in our lecture on authority, we can turn to its security apparatus. We can try to wield it in order to preserve its power in our hands. And of course, in so doing, the paradox is that we become the thing that we become the very thing that we were politically opposed to in the first place. And if you want to see an example of the cynical ways, I think, in which the power of the state can be used, you don't have to look much further than the case of Julian Assange, who's pictured here. He was, of course, the famous leader of WikiLeaks. And, before talking about his case, I think it's important to register that he and WikiLeaks are responsible for some truly historic and amazing achievements. The Collateral murder video, a little excerpt of it, which is in the bottom of your screen here, was leaked via the work of a man by the name of Bradley Manning, subsequently known as Chelsea Manning, because she has gone through a sex change and was, of course, in jail for a long time as a result of her actions. But at the time was Bradley Manning, and hacked some government information while being a soldier, I believe, in Iraq. And as a result of accessing these documents, being able to access these documents and bring them to public attention, we discovered information about untold numbers of atrocities. We discovered video information such as the Collateral murder video, which showed U.S. soldiers, U.S. pilots of a helicopter gunship, opening fire on a van, which had journalists in it. The pilots thought that the journalists were soldiers. They thought they were holding an RPG. They were holding a camera. But then the soldiers also opened fire on children and on people who were approaching the van in order to give first aid. And really, it was a very transformational video for those who watched it and who realized, just how little accountability there is in the way our soldiers operate in the field. It's harkened back to the Vietnam War and the reportage that came out by Seymour Hersh and other famous journalists in and around the so-called My Lai massacre, where, of course, a platoon of U.S. soldiers opened fire on a whole village of innocent people and bayoneted them, maybe sexually violated them, and burned their village down. So as a result of the work of WikiLeaks, it's, I think, unquestionable, although may not have been the only cause, but certainly unquestionable that WikiLeaks had a major role to play in inspiring the largest protests in human history, which are, of course, the protests in Egypt and elsewhere in the early part of this decade, which led to massive regime change in those parts of the world. The history of those events is still playing out. Certainly you can see that they've had very positive developments in places like Tunisia, maybe less positive in Egypt, but that, I think, that history is still playing out. So it may be too early to say what the long-term effects are, but the people in Middle Eastern countries got to see, to be precise, through the material WikiLeaks leaked, that much of what their governments were saying to them was a lie. For example, Egypt was publicly saying critical things about Israel and the way Israel was treating Palestinians, but privately, the Egyptian government was actually cooperating with Israel in furthering the goals of American foreign policy in the region. Naturally, people of the Middle East did not like discovering that their government was on completely the opposite side of what they had thought. So it led to massive protests. It wasn't the only reason, of course, but part of it was to do with the dictatorship that they were living under. But Assange himself, to go back to his case, had to take refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London in 2012. Lately, he has been expelled from that embassy by the Ecuadorian state. They have a new president in Ecuador, and he is not as sympathetic to Assange's case as the previous president was. And now Assange is detained and in prison in London, possibly, unlikely, in fact, I think, but we'll see, to be extradited to the United States. And if he's extradited to the United States, I think he can probably expect to spend the rest of his life in prison. Now, the original reason he went to the embassy, of course, was because of the fear of extradition. This is a complexity in the case, but there were, in Sweden, outstanding rape charges against Assange. To be clear, the Swedish criteria for what constitutes rape are very different to those in the United Kingdom and in the United States. There's a much lower bar. So as I understand it, the question was whether Assange had worn a condom. Now, neither of the women, as I understand it, and I've looked into this, certainly one of the women has been public on this, but my understanding from the police files which have been leaked is that neither of the women themselves have alleged rape. What they wanted was an AIDS or a HIV test. They wanted Assange to have a HIV test. But the Swedish prosecutor sort of took that up as an accusation of rape, and based on the women's statements, determined that there was probable cause that Julian Assange had not used appropriate protection when he had sex with these women, and consequently wanted to extradite him from Britain to Sweden for investigation, for evaluation, for interviewing. But there were strong reasons as well at the time to think that, given the information that Assange had been involved in publishing, that the charges were political. One of the women in particular did not really feel that this was appropriate to be pursuing Assange like this. The interview could be done in London. There was no need to extradite him. So it was thought, because the Swedish prosecutor was kind of escalating the matter to such a degree, and indeed, actually, interestingly, the charges against Assange had originally been dropped by a different prosecutor or by a different police investigator, and it was deemed that there was nothing more to be done, but the prosecutor kind of took the case back up again, and that's when people sort of had this light bulb moment and were like, yes, this maybe is political, because what it could have been is that the prosecutor, knowingly or unknowingly, we're not sure, but was actually kind of like playing into the hands of what was, at the time, the agenda of an American government, of what was at the time a government that was very keen to get its hands on Assange and punish him for his involvement in WikiLeaks. Why am I talking about all of this? Talking about all of this, again, because changing the world, doing the right thing, can be complex. I'm not going to sit here and say that Julian Assange is not guilty of some kind of a Swedish iteration of rape. It may well be that he is, but the question, of course, is doing justice in one respect can be doing an injustice in another. And I think this lecture today really is about this kind of complexity. So with that said, then, let's move on and look at some other examples. So, your book is really interesting on the question of this complexity, and the example it uses is the example of the Iraq War. Now, we're going to get a little philosophical in the slides to come, but just to sort of talk about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the protests that went on around that decision. It's a great example of the kind of complexity that we're talking about. We may want to go to protest against a war or to stop something bad happening, But one thing to recognize, I think, straight away is that protest itself doesn't necessarily work. Protest in 2003 didn't stop the Iraq War, despite being at the time the biggest global protest in human history. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up all around the world in over 600 cities to ask the Bush administration to not go to war in Iraq. Nevertheless, the war went ahead, and the war started in March of 2003. And within 2 months, George W. Bush, in a famous moment, landed in a jet fighter, a fighter bomber to be exact, on an aircraft carrier, and declared mission accomplished. The invasion had been a success, blah, blah, blah. Interestingly enough, of course, the war in Iraq, the war to maybe not take Iraq, but the war to keep the peace in Iraq went on and on and on, and actually didn't really end until 2011, and perhaps could be said to still be going on in some ways, because the US still has forces in the area. The power vacuum in Iraq led to the emergence of ISIS, as you know, and consequently then led to trouble in Syria, where US forces have been involved again in fighting jihadi extremists, for want of a better term. Now, critically, this war, the war in Iraq, belongs in our conversation today because the support for the war came from across the political spectrum. Many people did protest. People on the right, people on the left. Libertarians protested it. Socialists protested it. Ordinary families protested it. It was a widespread cry to not go to war. But equally many did support it, conservatives and liberals. Max Boot, famous neoconservative op-ed writer for the Washington Post and for other publications, was a leading public champion of the war. Michael Ignatieff, conversely, a leading, arguably left-wing critic of the violation of human rights around the world, also advocated the war. Why would a left-wing person advocate the war? Well, because, and Christopher Hitchens is another example here, it was seen that Saddam Hussein was a tyrant, a dictator, and getting rid of him could not be a bad thing in that sense if you have those kinds of concerns. So you had this kind of broad spectrum support, intellectual support among the newspaper columnists at least, for the war. And in the aftermath of 9/11, of course, so many people were out for payback, out for some kind of revenge, out to sort of fix the problem so that it could never happen again. And the White House had early on, according to the biographies of people like Richard Clarke and also the chair of the Treasury at the time, whose name is escaping me just now, but according to their biographies, it was clear from day one, right after 9/11 happened, there was an emergency meeting in the basement of the White House, and Donald Rumsfeld came into the room and basically said, okay, we're going to pin this on Iraq, So why would they do that? What was the argument there? Many people connected to a movement within the conservative movement, a specific subgroup called the neoconservatives or the neocons, who really had a vision that the aftermath of the Cold War had seen America kind of step back in the world too much, that having won the Cold War, America should be really sort of asserting itself more. And so consequently then, the plan they hatched was to generate a kind of a public relations campaign in and around the idea of weapons of mass destruction. And we know that the weapons of mass destruction now was not real, right? That the idea was, it wasn't that they thought they were there and then in good faith, found out that they weren't. We know now that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They were never found, and no evidence of their existence has ever been found. But what we also know, I think, and we knew even then, frankly, because there was a leaked British document called the Downing Street Memo, which I would encourage you guys to look up if ever you're curious, which showed that British intelligence services already knew prior to the invasion that the Americans were using the WMD argument as a pretext. In other words, that the Americans knew there were no WMD, that it was a front in order to legitimize what otherwise would be seen to be an illegitimate war. Curiously, during the Clinton years, the neocons, under the auspices of an organization called the Plan for a New American Century, or PNAC, P-N-A-C, Plan for a New American Century, had published many letters calling on Clinton to recognize Iraq as enemy number one for the United States. And in one of those letters, they had also recognized that, but of course, you probably won't be able to do anything about this, President Clinton, because in order to mobilize the United States to go into war in Iraq, it would probably take something like another Pearl Harbor, to unify Americans that way. And of course, the Pearl Harbor came, and the neoconservatives were waiting for a moment like this to happen one day, and they got their moment, right? I'm not one of these people, by the way, who believes that it was an inside job, that government somehow conspired to fake the attacks, or that there were no, there was no plane that went into the Pentagon, that it was a bomb, or that there were bombs planted in the World Trade Center. Or I'm not one of these people that disputes the melting point of steel. I think engineers and well-qualified people have done a pretty good job of rebutting those kinds of arguments. And by the way, what a kind of paradoxically racist thing to say, really, at the end of the day, to argue that Muslims living in Afghanistan couldn't hijack an airplane and fly it into a building, and wouldn't have the motivation to do it either, wouldn't be angry enough. I mean, Osama bin Laden had a history before 9/11. For 10 years prior to that, he'd been trying to take down the World Trade Center. He'd even tried to drive trucks into it before, full of explosives, and the US had entangled with him a number of times. So, his political standpoint on American involvement in Middle Eastern politics was already very well known, and so there's no real parsimony, in my view, to the argument that it was an inside job, or that the government or the neocons conspired to carry out 9/11 as a way of, creating a pretext for the war. I think they did use 9/11 as a pretext, but I don't think it was an inside job. So, to start to then talk about the politics of the war itself, many of you will be too young to remember this, but, what became sort of very contentious then, of course, and, in good faith, I think both the neocons and the liberals who supported them were trying to change the world. I mean, this is a lecture about trying to change the world, and we all had to take a side in this war, right? We all had to take a side, and many people in poor parts of the United States, Appalachia, elsewhere, working class families, they were the ones who were fighting the war. It wasn't the rich people who were fighting the war, but consequently, we saw a number of people driving around with cars, with bumper stickers, with, support our troops bumper stickers on the cars. And it became very kind of murky what all of this meant, because how would we support the troops? After all, there were a lot of veterans speaking out against the war. There were families of veterans who had died in previous wars that were speaking out against the war, Vietnam vets, etc. They were all basically sort of saying, like, this is obvious what this is, right? It's a war for oil. It's a war for American dominance in the world. It's a war for power. It's not a war against WMD. It's not a war for our security. There's a difference between, of course, a war of necessity and a war of choice, right? A war of necessity is a war you have to fight for your defense. A war of choice is a war where you are being avaricious. You want stuff. And of course, there were good arguments to be made that by invading Iraq, you would be liberating oil into the world markets, which would benefit American corporations. I don't personally think that that was the only factor, but I think it was an important factor. And I certainly think the corporations who drill oil, who mine for oil, were only too happy to have Iraqi oil being drilled, extracted in a more modern way, and in a way which would sort of finally get around the sanctions that Iraq had been under for the previous years. So many, anyway, saw the war as a war for oil, and for them, support the troops meant something very different. For them, supporting the troops would be bringing them home, getting them out of harm's way, so that they don't have to fight a rich man's war and put their lives on the line for someone else's profit line, because it's not like the soldiers were going to see any benefit from the oil, or maybe cheaper oil, but who wants to get a few pennies off a gallon of oil in exchange for potentially losing your life? I mean, it's not really a good trade, whereas there were those in position of power that were going to make millions and billions from that oil being extracted. So that was the debate about supporting the troops. And then equally, we were also, if we had divisions about supporting the troops and what that meant, we also had divisions about what it meant to think about the enemy here, because, I'll just bring up a useful slide here. If we're talking about supporting the troops, then we also have to talk about the civilians. Upwards on 200,000 Iraqi civilian non-combatants died in the war, according to official figures. Now, they were not all killed by Americans. Some of them were killed in the kind of general, broadly civil war-like conditions that prevailed in Iraq at the time. But many, indeed many were killed by Americans, especially in the early phases when the U.S. forces launched their mission and engaged in what was called shock and awe, which was a desire to sort of bomb the city of Baghdad to bits and pieces using very loud bombs, bomb the Iraqi armed forces using thundering rounds of bombs, to kind of put them into shell shock conditions so that they would be too shocked to respond to then what was coming next, which was the invasion. And there was a lot of collateral damage, what we euphemistically call collateral damage, during this campaign. And I think we have to be really careful when we use this term, because in saying collateral damage, we have to recognize that, people with real lives and real stories were being diminished from their status as human beings with human rights to being somehow less than human. We were treating these collateral damage, these victims of collateral damage, as sort of, somehow the necessary cost of war, right? The unavoidable cost of war. And of course, that's a choice, right? It's not that they're the unavoidable cost of war. They are the inevitable side effect of war. Reducing human life to collateral damage is therefore a very political thing to say. And, it's akin to treating human beings as disposable, or even treating them as animals, reducing them to what the philosopher Gambon would refer to as bare life, which I think is a very useful concept here.